Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa delivers his State of the Nation address this evening. The president himself has not shied from articulating the crisis in the country. Rolling blackouts, high unemployment, and affordable cost of living, and the increasing debt burden. But saying that many promises were made last year, let's look at how Ramaphosa's cabinet has dealt with what they themselves identified as priorities. Let's discuss this now with independent analyst and commentator Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good morning and thank you very much for your time. I must say it's a very important day for the president. He must in fact set the tone for the year ahead by indicating those priority areas that will unlock, or if we will, redirect our economic trajectory. Which issues do you expect to feature prominently in his address?
Morning and good morning to the viewers. I think inevitably the question of the country's energy security must feature prominently in the president's address. Over the past year, we've obviously seen the rapid deterioration of Eskom and obviously the consequences for the economy and society at large. And at this point in time, people are now expecting the president to sort of indicate whether he and his cabinet have any plan, anything that resembles a plan towards fixing the country's energy crisis and how fast it can essentially be rolled out. And obviously, we've heard in recent days that the ANC is even considering the idea of declaring the energy crisis a state of disaster and then enabling them to invoke the Disaster Management Act in order to be able to deal with it. The obvious problem with that is that absolutely no one beyond the ANC can explain exactly what that will change, because unfortunately, regardless of which act exists or doesn't exist, you're not going to be able to put together a new power station overnight. It's going to be a long-term game that is based on ensuring that we identify what the key priorities are and investing adequately in them, which is something that we clearly haven't done for the past 15 years.
So basically what you're saying, the 12 months that they've set for themselves to rid South Africa of load shedding is perhaps too ambitious. Now, I want us to have a look at the 2022 SONA commitments. They've made it easy for us. And this is hours before we get our new commitments. I'm sure you saw that booklet that was circulating, starting with Operation Vulindlela. Many have commended the fact that solar and wind projects of any size can now be built without a license after that removal of the 100 megawatts threshold. Your view on this? They've been able to tick the box at least with this commitment.
Well, yeah, I remember what happened last year is that the president essentially had to bypass the Minister of Minerals and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, who was still adamant that the answer was 10 megawatts. So historically, what business had argued was to say, look, if Eskom is struggling to provide electricity, give us the latitude or the license to be able to do it on our own. And they'd said that anything less than 50 megawatts would be pointless. So they issued a gazette, and Gwede Mantashe said the answer was 10 megawatts. So we remember that in the middle of last year, the president then essentially had a mid-morning press conference where he said that the answer is now 100, and then obviously beyond that, there's no limit whatsoever. But the problem with that particular approach is that it indicated that there's still an ideological difference of opinion between the president, the Minister of Public Enterprises, and the Minister of Minerals and Energy about what the definition of the country's energy security is. It was obviously welcomed by a lot of people on the basis that those that can will then start investing and then generating their own electricity. But again, it was never going to be an overnight thing. The other problem that the president failed to address is that it is not sufficient for him to simply say that the answer is no longer 10 megawatts. He also has to address the question of, well, all the other associated departments that have to grant approvals for me to be able to say I'm able to do this, are they also of the view that actually we need to accelerate this process? So if it turns out that I still need to go to the Department of Water Affairs, for example, in order to get a water license, depending on what it is that I want to put down, or if I still need to go to the Department of Minerals and Energy in order to get some particular approvals, and those two departments are still taking forever to execute on those, then obviously you're not going to fix the energy crisis anytime soon.
Which is in fact the reality now, because they're trying to expedite that by bringing or invoking the state of disaster, because they've been unable in these other departments to ensure that there's speedy movement. Then to the move for municipalities to procure energy from IPPs. Yes, government can tick this one off their list. But the real question is, will communities actually benefit from these reforms? Because many municipalities don't have funds, Khaya. They can barely pay Eskom. They surely won't utilize this ability to procure energy from IPPs.
Yeah, it's remarkably difficult because obviously some municipalities have essentially been taking the energy from Eskom and not paying for it. So you can imagine that if I'm an independent power producer, I will definitely not be in a position to provide electricity without getting paid on time. Some municipalities have abused the reality that they know that at the end of the day, Eskom is a state-owned entity and Eskom will only switch off the lights as a very last resort. Once you then start depending on private sector players, then the game is changed a bit because they will simply say that, look, until the money is in the bank account, we're not going to do anything. So I think a lot of struggling municipalities are probably not going to have very good relationships with independent power producers, and they cannot be solely reliant on them. They're still probably going to have Eskom as a primary supplier on the basis that they can be able to negotiate more favorable payment terms to Eskom, which is something that definitely none of the independent power producers are going to be in a position to accept.
And then let's shift our focus now to government's commitments around supporting the growth of small businesses. They managed to host the 4th South African Investment Conference, as they said they would, tick a box. They received 300 billion in investment commitments. Now, with that one, it seems to be a phrase or a term that many are uncomfortable with. Can you dissect this for us? When we speak commitments, it's not actually an investment. There may be an opportunity to convert into an investment. Should we really be clapping for government if they've got commitments?
No. I'd like to marry you, but until I pay lobola and until we actually walk down the aisle, I actually haven't done anything. So the issue here is that when you go and make these appeals to the investment community, and then you say to them, look, this is a country that is worth investing in, they may agree and say, look, of course we agree with the fact that, this is definitely an investment destination. But then there are particular expectations that, look, if you are saying to me that I must invest and I'm a person who builds or manufactures products, for example, I need to be able to say that my manufacturing line, whether it's my factory or any other part, is going to be able to run at the times that I want. So you cannot then come back to me and say, oh, by the way, by the time you get here, we cannot guarantee that you'll actually be able to run your production line because there's no electricity at very significant times of the day. So until you then fix the infrastructural bottlenecks, a lot of those commitments are never going to materialize. So, of course, if you're then pleading to the investor community, particularly foreign investors, to say, look, come and invest in this country, you'll be able to produce particular items here and then sell them to the global markets. If Transnet is not functioning, if the rail infrastructure is not functioning, then it is impossible for them to actually get all of those products to the market. So, of course, those commitments will remain there, but they're never going to materialize into actual investments. And that's what we've seen ever since the president came into power, in that obviously, given his ability to convince or persuade international investors, commitments have been made, but none of that is actually translated into tangible investments for a lot of those particular commitments.
Then to land reform, as per the document. They had 4 commitments for the previous year. They made absolutely no progress. I'm sure you saw that part. It was blank. All of those boxes were not ticked green, red, or any other color. All 4. Do you get a sense, honestly, that government is serious about this program, or they just love to use those emotive phrases like, we need to address the original sin of land dispossession?
There is a lot of rhetoric, and I think our great tragedy is that the government has actually lost the ability to define what the definition of land reform ought to be. So, of course, what they have said is that when they came into power in 1994, there was this particular target that they said, look, by a particular point in time, we want to have at least 30% of the land in black hands. But for as long as we cannot even get a credible audit that tells us exactly who owns what parts of land in the country, it is very difficult to assess the state of land reform. And I think also historically, we do know that they've approached it in a manner that just made it so remarkably expensive for them to facilitate land reform. So the budget that the department gets is quite simply insufficient to get them moving forward. The precedents that they've set, where they were paying market value for parts of land that needed to be transferred from white farmers or white hands into black hands in particular, simply means that everybody who then gets a notification that, look, we believe that your land is subject to a transfer, that person has an expectation of market value. And the longer you hold this out, the more expensive that definition of market value becomes. So the government actually no longer has an understanding of what its own definition of land reform is. So they're simply hoping that a lot of people simply just move on from the issue. We just don't have a credible plan for land reform. What really happens is just marginal, very small gains in the essence of transferring land. And when the land is transferred, we do not see the requisite support for people that are then the new recipients of land, in order to ensure that if it was farming land, if it was productive land, it doesn't then become idle. So we've got very, very terrible examples. The Bediela farm, for example, is one that indicates that what happens when you mismanage the process of land transfers.
And Malamala, we saw what happened with Malamala and Mpumalanga. But
Yes.
government aside, if we look at this from a political lens, I mean, this matter is so worrying because it was so serious that a political party was literally founded on just the need to address the land issue. And they have a great following with just that cardinal pillar, number one. That's the EFF. Now, politically, one would think as the ANC, you want to move with greater speed because perhaps you could dismantle a whole party that was founded on just addressing this problem if you decided to expedite. What does that mean politically for the African National Congress?
Quite ironically, even the ANC itself, when it was founded in 1912, it was based on that question because we know that by the time 1913 came, then the Native Land Act became the law. So when the ANC was formed, it was actually in light of the awareness that there was going to be this significant change in land ownership and land usage patterns in the country. So both parties have that as a primary cardinal pillar. But I think obviously the big problem is that once the ANC came into power and came into government, it then had to engage in a whole lot of trade-offs and concessions. And I think one of the great compromises related to how exactly the land question was going to be dealt with, as I mentioned earlier on, the initial target was, I think, 30% of land needed to be transferred to black hands. So one could then go back and say, but why 30% when you said that the original sin was actually the mass plunder of land that was taken from black hands as far back as 1913 and through all the other different acts that were promulgated, the 1936 Native Trust Land Act, for example. So if the parties are founded on that universal premise that we've got a land problem, you'd expect them to exercise a sense of greater agency in dealing with that particular question. And I think the ANC has unfortunately just not got the right models since 1994 of getting that right. And of course, the EFF then highlights that at its primary cardinal pillar. And if the ANC wanted to take some political capital away from the EFF, you'd expect them to do something different about land. We do know that in the aftermath of that 2017 elective conference, they wanted to take away that political capital from the EFF about the question of expropriation without compensation. But what they then did is that they then put the process through a parliamentary process that is essentially just killed it. Because for the past 5 years, we've been having conversations, we've been having public hearings. We still do not have a definitive question of whether Section 25 of the Constitution needs to be amended, and if it needs to be amended, what exactly should it say in order to facilitate the process. And also, quite importantly, we do know, unfortunately, that under the ANC government, just because a law exists, just because a constitutional amendment exists, doesn't mean that those particular issues are going to be addressed or implemented, because they do have a paralysis when it comes to implementation.
And then lastly, this one is actually quite heartbreaking. On fighting corruption, they ticked the box on strengthening the NPA and made no movements on their commitment to take steps to protect whistleblowers. I mean, one then just thinks of Mathangoye. You think of Ethel Williams, who's in exile in democratic South Africa. He's had to uproot his whole family. It's one thing for people to consider moving because there's a great job opportunity in the UK or America. But even then, it's quite traumatic to decide to move. But if you're moving just to protect your life, and then you look at these commitments that government has made no movement, they couldn't tick a box, any color there. What do you make of that?
I think the tragedy of Papita Deokaran probably is the one that centers the issue here, because you'd imagine that once a particular government or once a particular president has said that, look, we want to kill corruption, we want to deal with corruption decisively, the people that enable you to do it, whether it's whistleblowers or whether, it's rank and file members of society who come to you and say, look, I wanted to get this particular service from Home Affairs, but somebody wanted to charge me for something that ought to be free. You would think that there'd be a very clear roadmap of how we're going to deal with this. There'd be a very clear roadmap of, now that we know that whistleblowers are the ones that enabled us to actually deal with some of these big corruption matters, this is how we need to protect them. The fact that they have to keep making individual appeals to the president and they get soundly ignored simply means that the president just quite simply doesn't believe that there should be stronger protections for whistleblowers. Legislators themselves haven't taken any steps to say, look, perhaps let us create a law that enables people to know that once you've actually enabled us to solve the corruption scourge in the country, these are the protections that you're going to get. So I think in relation to that, we know that the commitment just simply isn't there. And it doesn't help that, unfortunately, in a lot of these corruption instances, whether it's in the private or the public sector, the people that commit acts of corruption end up with having the type of resources that enable them to fight and deal with the system in a manner that a lot of whistleblowers in particular, who are just doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, are quite simply unable to fight back. So until we have a new system that enables us to give the power back to the people that don't have resources, we are unfortunately going to be stuck with this corruption problem.
And the reality is citizens are very intelligent. When they look at that commitment, that here you are, you've strengthened the NPA. The NPA will prosecute who if there are no whistleblowers to bring cases to the SAPS? So meaning you're strengthening them to take which cases before the courts?
Yeah, and I think obviously, even when you look at the litmus test of the Zondo Commission, which said that these are the people that we think have got a question to answer, it doesn't help that the same president who says I'm committed to fighting corruption then appoints people who are implicated in the Zondo Commission report to cabinet positions. And that not only deals with the judicial tensions, but also the question of, well, what are the optics that you think the rest of society sees when they heard testimonies from Zizi Kodwa, for example, and yet this is the person that you then elevate into your inner circle? Because it is difficult to reconcile that with a commitment to saying that, look, we want to exile everybody that has been implicated in matters of great corruption. We want to exile everybody who's been implicated in the Zondo Commission, for example, because this was the one commission that we put together to try and unpack what had gone wrong in the state. So when we see those people then walking right behind you, walking beside you as members of your cabinet, and then we hear what the commitment that you're making, it just doesn't match up. Eh?
We've unfortunately run out of time, but I need to pick your brain on just this one. SA Tourism, they're going to continue with their investigation to establish who was that whistleblower. Your views on that?
It's a tricky one, because I do think that we have to acknowledge that an organization of that nature has a particular mandate to promote South Africa as a tourism destination. But I think that the problem that we're facing here is that a lot of us are thinking that perhaps the investment that is being made into that particular football team for that particular amount is a bit excessive in relation to what we think the outcomes are going to be. Now, remember, South Africa does not suffer from a lack of awareness in relation to the UK tourism industry, for example. So people then have to legitimately ask, well, what is this additional investment going to generate? Because everybody in the UK who wants to travel already knows that South Africa is a destination that they want to go to. It's a different case when you look at a country like Rwanda, for example, where, of course, the general awareness about it as a tourism destination was not particularly strong. So for them, that investment was necessary. So I do think that we have to interrogate the substance or the quantum of the investment.
And legitimately
but we shouldn't be entering it. Yeah.
Legitimately so, we
but
can
I think
interrogate the substance, but the whistleblower, should they be pursuing the person who leaked this information to the Daily Maverick? Just that aspect. Should they be pursuing that person?
I mean, it gets us nowhere, because once they know who it is, then what does it change? We already know it's in the public domain. It was going to be in the public domain eventually. So perhaps their anxiety is the fact that it was released prematurely, but you are not going to spend R1 billion of public funds on supporting a foreign football team without people knowing. So eventually we're going to get there. So I'm not particularly sure what they think they're going to achieve by identifying who the whistleblower is.
Khaya, thank you very much for your time this morning. That was independent analyst and commentator Khaya Sithole. To the story.